would be great if we could be doing this in person, but the times are what they are. And I'm aware that we've got a lot of people joining us online, which is really terrific. Just to give you some context to start, we've got a very strong tradition in the UK of news reporting, and we might perhaps pride ourselves on having a robust and strong media. It's one of the pillars of a democratic society. And so it might surprise you to learn that in the last few weeks, the UK has actually been formally warned for threatening press freedom after the government blocked a group of investigative journalists and denied them access to information. The National Union of Journalists has recently put out a notice detailing threats to 2 journalists, one from the Liverpool Echo, another from The Guardian, and the union is gathering evidence about different types of threats to journalists and journalism in the UK. And in other ways, politicians this year have avoided scrutiny on certain platforms. Earlier in the year, Radio 4's Today programme, for example, was boycotted by ministers. The Daily Mirror last year was banned from the Tory battle bus. So this is the context in which we are going to be discussing the issues today about the challenges that face reporting and reporters in the UK and abroad. We'll be looking at just what constraints should be placed on journalists, by whom, and what sort of practices are acceptable. Now, you'll all be aware of the Leveson inquiry of 2011, which was a judicial public inquiry into the culture, the practices and the ethics of the British press following the phone hacking scandal. So a lot of these issues were aired then. This evening, we'll be discussing media freedom in the UK and further afield. So what does a free press mean? Why does it matter? And what challenges are there? Just to say, this is a particularly poignant time for the John Schofield Trust, because this year marks 25 years since John was killed in 1995 whilst reporting for the BBC's World Tonight programme in Croatia. Let me introduce you now to our panellists, who are very kindly giving their time in their busy schedules to share their experiences and insights with us this evening. You will have time to ask questions by sending them in writing using the chat facility that you see on your screen. So do please, start sending in questions now, or if things occur to you while people are speaking, please do send them in, and I'll try and remind you to do that while the panel has its discussion. The way this will run will be that the panel will have a discussion for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be about 20 minutes at the end for you to put your questions. So I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Crawford, who is senior correspondent at Sky News, Jodie Ginsberg, CEO of Internews Europe, Sean O'Neill, who is chief reporter of The Times, and Ben de Pear, who is editor of Channel 4 News. So good evening to you all. I just wondered if I could start off with a general question that to put to all 4 of you. If you could just give us your thoughts about this. Given where we are at the moment, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, we're on the verge of ending the Brexit transition phase, we've got US elections in 3 weeks' time. What for you is the biggest challenge? And let's start alphabetically. I'll start with Alex Crawford.
Well, first of all, I think probably the biggest challenge is being believed, because there is so much disinformation, misinformation, there's so much propaganda perpetuated against genuine, real journalists and journalism, that it's quite hard to make your way through the sort of forest of lies and stories that try to discredit you and everyone's outfit. I mean, I hate the whole phrase of mainstream media. I hate the phrase that it's fake news, all of which is designed to besmirch, belittle, intimidate, even cow real journalists and journalism. And it's being done in a sort of range of different ways, I feel, subtle and not so subtle. You can get shelled, or people can attempt to kill you in Syria, but you can get stopped from coming to a news conference in Britain. Or you can have the leader of the so-called free world actually telling an estimated 22,000 lies since he's been in office for the past 4 years. And it has the same effect, because it not only leads to a genuine misunderstanding. It also perpetuates fear amongst journalists, and it also generates violence, I think, against journalists and journalism. So refusing to come on a news programme, refusing to talk to journalists as part of, you know, Wimbledon players have to face the media at the end of their game. Politicians should as well, I think, in every country. They shouldn't have the option of deciding who they talk to and who they don't talk to. Likewise, I also think that the state that we're in at the moment, there needs to be a clarion call to all journalists to stand up for each other, because the only people who are going to save journalists are other journalists right now. We can't rely on anyone else, really. And I think that's a really sad state of affairs. But I think journalism, genuine journalism, is probably at the worst place it's ever been. I had to come to Britain recently to report on coronavirus, or not that recently, in March. And I was shocked at the state of denial amongst a lot of journalists about just what's going on in that country. I'm speaking from Istanbul, Turkey, which has one of the worst records against journalists in the world. And I was really shocked at what was going on in Britain, how difficult it was to report properly, how access to places was handed out like sweeties to favoured journalists or people that they thought wouldn't cause problems. And also I was really surprised at the gullibility of the British people in believing absolutely everything. They seem to be stuck in an era 10 or 20 years ago where they actually think the politicians are telling them truths, and most of the time they're not. And also there seems to be a muddle over what you're allowed to report as an independent journalist. Independence means actually questioning those lies, not just reporting them. It actually means calling them out and saying when someone is a liar or a racist or spreading hate crime. It's not just reporting it or giving the other side. Sometimes there aren't two sides. There isn't two sides to a lie, for instance. Is that too
okay? No, that is plenty. That is plenty. Thank you very much. Jodie Ginsberg, same question to you.
Well, I think I agree with Alex. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is a decline in support from governments that brand themselves as democracies for media freedom. You know, it's always been interesting to me as a media freedom campaigner that people would always say, well, we have media freedom here, but over there, those are the bad guys, you know, the people who are really doing the silencing and the arresting. But here in the UK, everything is rosy. And I think increasingly over the past 3 to 5 years, what we've seen is a really rapid decline in support from democratic governments, public support for a free and independent press. And when you have from the very top, the leader of the free world calling journalists the enemies of the people, what you do is set in train a situation that essentially makes journalists fair game. So it's no wonder that journalists get a huge amount of abuse, for example, on social media, because the people at the very top are saying these are people not to be trusted, don't believe anything they say. And at the same time, those very politicians are also continuing to spout repeated nonsense, and I do think there is a challenge for the industry in making sure that they are able to hold those politicians to account and calling them out when they do lie, when they are racist. I think it's really, really important and incumbent on the industry to be able to do that. I think the other big challenge that is making this much worse is obviously financial. So Internews works in more than 80 countries around the world, and the most terrifying thing to us is that what we saw already was a huge decline in sort of the traditional advertising revenue for broadcast and for news, and then the pandemic hit, and that's been devastating for some organizations, particularly in nascent democracies where they were really just beginning to move out of the shadow of autocratic regimes and start to build industries based on advertising revenue, based on subscriptions, and have seen their incomes absolutely decimated. And for those where we really need a pluralistic, independent and flourishing media, urgently need to find new sources of revenue. So I think between the lack of accountability at governmental and level and from leaders, coupled with this financial challenge, makes this a really dangerous and difficult time for journalists and journalism.
Two very sobering opinions there. Sean O'Neill, do you share their pessimism?
I do. I'm probably even more pessimistic, to be honest. I think it's a real existential crisis moment for journalism, because I think it's partly our own fault, as well as all the pressures we face that Alex and Jodie have outlined. There are problems with the loss of trust that I think in part we have created ourselves through, you date that back to phone hacking and carrying on from that. I think we've struggled to regain that trust, and that has allowed people to attack journalism. It has allowed a lot of what used to be called citizen journalism, and is now just this kind of unregulated wild west of internet journalism. But also, I think that there's a public phenomenon, and I'm going to quote, there was a fantastic article in Sunday Times magazine a couple of weeks ago by John Lanchester on how smartphones have taken over our minds. But he identified what he called a phenomenon in there, and that was the fact that on a mass scale, people seem to have given up caring about the idea of truth. And I think that's absolutely true. It seems to me increasingly that no matter what scandal we report on, no matter what we expose, it makes no difference. You know, there are complete incompetence in government today, whose incompetence has been repeatedly exposed, yet they stay in their jobs and the civil servants lose their jobs. You know, how does Dominic Cummings break all the rules that his government creates and stay in his job? There would have been a time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when the media coverage of that would have generated his departure. But they feel safe in ignoring it now, because we have lost the trust of our readership and our audiences and much of the public. Story I've been working on for the last week is about disinformation, the Russian disinformation campaign against one of the UK vaccines. And I've been talking to a lot of people who deal in analysing disinformation all the time. And they talk about something called motivated reasoning, which is prevalent among the public, and best explained as people believe what they want to believe. They're uncomfortable believing what is shown to be true. They just want to be in their echo chamber, have reinforced what they already believe. So I think we're in a really, really difficult place for journalism. I fear as we go forward how we survive and how we thrive economically. It's a really hard time for everyone at the moment, but for journalism, newspapers in particular, I might say. But I think, was it Alex who said that only journalists can stick together and solve this? We have to somehow persist and keep going and keep fighting, because most of us, vast majority of us, not all of us, because there are some people I think it's really, I'm really uncomfortable with how many political journalists then become political spokespersons. I find that really weird. But the rest of us have to stick together and keep fighting.
Okay. Ben de Pear.
I feel pretty bleak as well. Do you want me to back on how bleak I feel? Actually, I'll start with a positive point. I think that trust in TV news has gone up. Volumes of people watching public service broadcasting TV news has gone up significantly during the pandemic. Our own numbers doubled at one point, and we were putting on 2 hours of news on Channel 4 instead of 1 hour. I think that's because people panicked, and when people panicked, they thought, shit, what do I believe? Who do I believe? And I think they came to TV news, and they also came to newspapers, and they came to respected journalistic organs, because we still do have a lot of trust from the public. People do recognize that we're professionals, and people do trust us. It's just not in the numbers that it used to be. And that's because we have governments and people in high levels who are saying you can't trust journalists. And because of the internet, and because of the absolute inability for any government or international body to regulate the platforms, who are still making enormous amounts of money from everything they do without producing any content. They make enormous amounts of money from Channel 4 News, and they give us a pittance in return, and they put us out as one version of the truth against every other version of the truth that's out there. And whilst educated and older people, and increasingly for our demographic, younger people, are turning to television news because they trust it, there is this gap of people who are exploited by those two things, which is the political leaders in the world at the moment, and the rancid conditions that are created by the platforms that still are making probably in an hour or in half an hour what it costs to produce the whole of Channel 4, let alone Channel 4 News, in a year. They will burn through, and we will argue with them, could you give us a bit more for getting 1 billion views of our material? And they will still say, oh, we don't really have the money, and no one's forcing them to do it. When you talk about favoritism, there is a favoritism at the moment that's going on amongst broadcast journalists. There are certain broadcast news programs and organizations that get every interview, they get the briefings, and then there is a pecking order, which we're still in. We still get the odd minister every 2 or 3 weeks, so that we can't claim that we are boycotted, which we're not. There are other parts of broadcast media, Newsnight and GMB. I mean, GMB is a bit of an outlier, I would say, because of Pears, but do get no ministers at all. And we're talking about a pandemic when possibly at the beginning they said 500,000 people could die. Tens of thousands have died, and we're still arguing on a daily basis as to whether we can ask the government a question about it. It's absurd and it's obscene, and we still play this game. We work our collective arses off to make the best news program we can. We have reporters, cameramen, producers going in and out of hospitals during the height of an epidemic, and then we're playing a game of footsie all day long to see if the government wants to talk about it. When they do come on, if we ask a difficult question, we have to face the wrath afterwards. And I think that those two conditions, the governments of the world at the moment, politicians, and the internet have created a pretty rancid time for everyone. That said, I think the government are wonderful, and we'd love to have them on.
Well, that is a very bleak assessment from all four of you, and it's really interesting because, Ben, you did point to the fact that there has been more interest in broadcast news and in print news and online audiences. There's a recent survey that suggested the UK public has a sort of newfound appreciation of journalism compared to before the start of the COVID pandemic and afterwards. So it feels to me like what you're saying is that there is an appetite for information and for facts, but what all of you seem very frustrated by is being able to hold anybody to account for the handling of the situation. Is that right? Let me put that to Alex.
Yeah, that's absolutely definitely right. And I think Ben brought up one of the key things, which is the internet. That needs to be regulated. It's absolutely crazy that everyone else on the TV channels that I work at, there are so many strictures and regulations and do's and don'ts about what you can show, what you can say, how you do it, when you deliver it, when you show it, and there's none on the internet. Secondly, they are probably the biggest font of disinformation in the whole world, and it's being pumped out all the time. So we can't just ignore that. You can't be saying the Times can't do this and Channel 4 can't do that and Sky News can't do this, but the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter can do absolutely anything. It's completely an unfair playing field. And we, genuine journalists and journalism, are losing out. It's like Manchester United losing 7-0. You know, it's really, really bad. It can't be overstated. Secondly, I think the politicians and the people who are the decision makers, absolutely, there needs to be a formula where they are forced to be held to account. You know, I understand, I'm not an expert in this, but I understand, like in Germany, the politicians are invited to their equivalent of the lobby to answer questions. It's not the other way around, where you have to put yourself as a journalist, as a person who's trying to seek the truth and put out what is accurate and honest. And let's face it, the bulk of journalists are in that camp. It's not up to, they don't have to jostle for position to try and get into position, and often don't. And the whole daily briefings thing is a real double-edged sword, because that is not an open way of getting information. It's very much the opposite, it seems to me, where you are given information, presented in a certain way, and then shut down when you try to query it. And then the journalists get criticised for asking the wrong questions. I mean, the whole world has slightly gone topsy-turvy when it's been changed like that. I know, Reeta, you were saying at the start, there seems to be a contradiction in that more people are turning to trusted news outlets, but at the same time as trust is being undermined. They're desperate for news. Everyone is desperate for news, and they're looking, because it's changing so quickly. You're like, everyone's on this world roller coaster and we can't keep up. But at the same time that that's happening, almost every time you turn on the telly or you look at Twitter, everything that trusted outlets are doing is being denigrated in one way or the other. I mean, in every which way you look at it. And obviously the President of America is one extreme, but it's him behaving like that, or the Prime Minister of Britain behaving in a similar way, but in his own British way, it's just the same, has a drip-down effect to dictators and despots across the world, and they're all following suit. So I think journalists need to get a lot tougher. They need to bandy together and remember that we're all part of the same tribe, and we need to find a few teeth and take on these establishments, these organizations, these governments, and let it be known that it's not even just letting it be known. We've got to do something actually proactive to stop this erosion of journalism.
So Sean O'Neill, there are two major problems. There is one, as Alex has put it, the establishments, the governments who won't be held to account. And then there is the members of the public who want the facts, who think that their opinions are the facts. How do you deal with that? How do you try and tell people that what they want to be true isn't necessarily true?
I knew the answer to that, Reeta. I don't, I'll be honest with you, I don't have a lot of time to think about that, because every story I seem to touch nowadays, I find myself in a really adversarial battle to get that story out. My interest is in getting the story out there and just hoping that because of the Times masthead and because maybe the BBC or Sky and people will follow it up, it will be believed. But every story has become a real battle, and I've noticed in the last 5 years or so that my dealings with PR people, be they government press officers or private PR, have become much more confrontational. There used to be a time, I think, as a reporter, when you thought the job of the press person you were talking to was to answer your questions, find out the truth. I find increasingly that they see their job as to shut down the story, to absolutely trample all over it at every opportunity. And I first encountered this, and I tell you, my blood boiled, because I was writing about a cancer drug that the NHS had decided by a stroke of a pen to cross out a nice recommendation and say this cancer drug could not be made available to quite a large category of patients. Now, I just happened to be one of those patients. I was told that a drug that NICE had recommended I could not have. And I had a battle for about 3 months with NHS England press office that became very personal and very nasty and very aggressive. And the press officer on the other side was a former newspaper journalist as well. I was kind of gobsmacked by what was going on. They just lied to my face. They complained about everything I wrote. But after 3 months, they had to cave in. But it was an absolute battle. And I find that increasingly now at every level when I go to do a story. And when the PR guys fail, in step the lawyers, the bigwig lawyers, especially if you're dealing with private sector oligarchs, billionaires, people like that. And they start trying to intimidate the hell out of you with massive legal letters before you've written a word, before you've published a word. And I think I'm lucky. I've got a good, experienced legal department behind me. And, they know, they can see the bullshit. But smaller outlets, local papers, local journalists can be easily intimidated by this stuff. And I think a lot of stories are being suppressed by what I would call professional enablers. And this is not the screaming and shouting on Twitter and abusing journalists. This is the stuff that goes on under the radar, behind the scenes. And it spills over into the courts, where I think open justice is really in retreat in our courts. I've spent the last 2 to 3 years battling some awful cases in the High Court where the judges are siding with Russian oligarchs and giving them secrecy, or British millionaires. We had an extraordinary case last year. We had to get up in the end. We had a Mr. X on our hands. And a judge ruled at an employment appeal tribunal that this man who had paid out compensation to people he had allegedly sexually assaulted, his employees, the judges said we couldn't publish his name because the public wouldn't understand the difference between allegations and proven facts. Which basically, when you think about it, negates the whole purpose of court reporting in any court in the land. This guy thought his secrecy, basically. And I see that rolling with an encroaching privacy law coming as well. There's some extraordinary cases before, one going for the Supreme Court there this year, which basically undermine all the tenets of crime reporting. I've been a crime reporter for 20 years, really. And that I find that battle increasingly difficult, especially if you're doing a piece of investigative work or something like that. It really is hard to get the fact out there in the first place. Never mind persuade the public that they should believe it.
Okay. Ben, have you had instances where you felt the courts are too restrictive?
The courts are different for TV journalists because we attend them and we do court reporting from outside. But we've done a number of investigations. Weirdly, we've done a lot of big investigations in the last 3 or 4 years. The 2 biggest that we did, bizarrely, Cambridge Analytica, which in the last week or 10 days, because the Information Commissioner's investigation found that Cambridge Analytica was not connected to Brexit, has become a source of controversy. Our investigation never said they were connected to Brexit. Our investigation was just us being undercover with them for 3 months and then editing a piece which showed what they said about themselves. And our piece, actually, we wrote against what they were saying. We were saying, this next bit is going to sound extraordinary and we can't fully verify it, but they say they use prostitutes in order to lure politicians into compromising positions. So actually, some of the investigations we've done, especially involving undercover work, has been quite legally easy. We showed this to a QC, for example, and the QC said, you're actually not saying anything, they're saying it themselves. But the trickiest part is when we make allegations against the platform. So in that story, we made a number of allegations about how Facebook had opened up millions, in fact, tens of millions of people's data to be used by Cambridge Analytica and other political agencies to distort democracy. And Facebook refused to engage with us for about 2 weeks. And then the night before we were running our story, and the New York Times and Observer were running theirs, they then leaked it to other newspapers and other organizations, not to us. So they put their right to reply out to them. And it's that sort of cynical activity that we do go to the court many times and challenge orders and production orders and things like that, but the court is not always the greatest place for television if you can't film inside it. But what I do find is this network of lawyers and PR people who protect the platforms in particular. And so you could be asking questions for a long time, which they refuse to answer. And then the day before you're going to publish or broadcast something, they suddenly leak their answers or your story to all your rivals. And it's just unbelievable behavior. And when you try and report that, no one's interested because they're interested in your undercover. But if you write a line in, and we went to Facebook and we asked them for a right to reply, they haven't given us one, but instead they leaked our story to everyone else. People will go, all right. But they won't actually step back and think, well, what does that mean? It meant that they not only were they not admitting fault, they were seeking to do the most amount of damage to our journalism by leaking it to others. I mean, the cynicism of it was just extraordinary. We followed up with a big Trump data investigation a couple of weeks ago. And again, we haven't had Facebook appear on Channel 4 News for 2.5 years, despite having exposed the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We exposed the Trump data scandal, which former President Obama talked about. We asked for Facebook to come on. They don't come on. They go on the BBC multiple times a year, or they go somewhere else. And you think, well, what are the questions that are being asked here? And what are the conditions of this interview? So I think the more powerful a body is, the more likely they are now to do a deal. And we were talking about Nick Clegg, by the way. He used to be the Deputy Prime Minister. He used to actually want to be Prime Minister of this country. He's someone who won't appear on Channel 4 News to talk about the distortion of democracy by the company he's being paid millions to represent. But he'll appear somewhere else and won't face the questions because no one wants to ask about our investigation, which is another thing that slightly annoys me about this. I'm getting really wound up now. About this period of history is that sometimes we don't cooperate with each other when we have good stories, and we don't follow up because of the competition we have. So the BBC have never asked a question of Nick Clegg that we might ask, or when I've messaged journalists who might be asking that question, Nick Clegg, please ask him this. We've been trying for 2 years. It won't be asked. Yeah, it's all shit.
No, it is. We are competitive, aren't we? Yes, and perhaps that's just not really we don't actually end up in the place that we want to be. I think the point that you make about the media, about audiences being turned off by the media reporting on the media, I mean, that is just always the way, isn't it? It's just
yes, and
we're gazing, and even if it's saying into the story.
And we have a policy here that we never report on Channel 4 or Channel 4 News, but certainly the process by which we get a story and they try and stop us is interesting, but is only so interesting, but doesn't seem to surprise anyone anymore. No. It seems to be the cost of doing business.
I'm going to go on with this discussion for another 5 to 10 minutes. Please do send in your questions. There's so much good stuff being said here. So do use the chat facility and send them in. Jodie Ginsberg, I wanted to ask you about media ownership. Does it matter if various media platforms, media, are concentrated in too few hands?
Absolutely. I mean, media plurality is absolutely key to media freedom. You need a plurality of voices, and I accept what Ben says about competition, and sometimes it would be great to see journalists, as Alex said, just speaking for the profession of journalism and for one another. And certainly in the States, I think you see that much more, that sort of solidarity when one group is denied access, for example, to a speaker, others will speak out in solidarity. I think that happens less here, unfortunately. But it absolutely matters if you have a highly concentrated media market, because it allows powerful interests to co-opt the messaging. And you see that particularly in countries where particular political parties or governments have huge influence in one media sector or the other. I mean, Alex is in Turkey, that's certainly the case there. We see it in Hungary and in Poland. It allows the entire discourse to be co-opted either by big, powerful political interests or corporate interests. I would say for the UK, we're lucky to still have a highly vibrant, noisy, pluralistic media. I think there are some challenges within it, particularly about access to unnamed sources. There seems to be have a massive proliferation recently of people quoting government sources or people close to governments. That seems to have worsened, I think. I've been a journalist over 20 years. That definitely seems to have worsened our willingness to kind of just quote, Joe Blogg's government, source close to the government, and as if that was gospel without challenging that. And I do worry about that. But absolutely, ownership matters. We've got to have different types of ownership. We've got to have many vibrant, different types of media. What we also need is to make sure that that is serving a really diverse group. I think that's the other thing. I think sometimes we think ownership is a proxy for everything else, and it's not. And we absolutely, ownership and diversity of ownership is key. But within that, we've also got to think about, are those media outlets truly representative and serving their communities? And I think one of the things that desperately worries me, actually, and Sean referenced it in talking about sort of courts and representation, and is local journalism. That the local journalism, your local paper, which is going to council meetings and holding councils to account and asking questions about how your local council, the people who really have a huge amount of influence about your day-to-day, what your road looks like, how often your bins are collected, what your schooling is like, people with great power over your day-to-day lives. And we're carving out the local media outlets that have traditionally reported on those. So no one's going to those council meetings and asking those questions. No one's free to go to the courts and report on the issues in the local courts. And one of the things that I worry about when we have these conversations about, with media and terrible things are happening to media on a global scale, is often we neglect to talk about who is serving local communities and who is serving different kinds of communities. And I know, obviously, John Schofield Trust is an issue close to their heart, but who is doing the reporting is also really, really important, not just who owns the reporters.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the floor after this next question. We have got a superbly experienced foreign correspondent in Alex Crawford on our panel. So I have to ask you, Alex, about your experience of reporting elsewhere, how it compares, and also whether you've got any thoughts about the US presidential election, although I think you've shared some of them already.
Well, I think it's tough all round, and I think it's got tougher. But as I say, because if the head boy of the whole school is telling the whole world or his school that you can bully and you can stamp on them, you can deride them, you can belittle them, that I'm talking about journalists, then everyone else follows the head boy. And so in countries where you might traditionally think is difficult, yeah, it's really difficult. Syria, level of intimidation, almost everywhere where you would work. I've just come back from Yemen a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago, and I reported on both sides, which is not that easy, given the multiple armed checkpoints that you have to cross and the crossing of lines. And I was one side took us off air because I had suggested that both sides were responsible for war crimes. And this has reached a ridiculous level. I mean, an actually very, very dangerous level, because that they were taking a foreign reporter off. They virtually got carte blanche to do whatever they like to the local journalists, which itself is an outrage. They've got 4 under arrest, which they've threatened to execute. Journalists reporting on human rights and potential war crimes, those are Yemenis. But to actually do it to a foreign reporter means that people are those in authority, those in power are far more emboldened to take this approach towards journalists. In America, which I went to report on coronavirus a couple of months ago, they are believing everything about the, well, they were then. It'd be interesting to see what's happening now, because at the time I went, they were telling me it was a hoax. One woman screamed at me, a whole, small group of them. I thought they were actually, she was going to rip my mask off because she was so upset at us wearing masks, which she said was perpetuating the whole untruth and the fear about coronavirus because it didn't exist. I mean, that's the level, that's how it's being believed. So I think it really does matter how people who are perceived to be leaders of democracies act, and that includes Britain. So, I also want to say, a bit about two things. One, I definitely think journalists need to lose this ridiculous rivalry, or else we're all going to eat each other up. And there's no one's going to be left apart from a little shell of maybe a small little corner of Channel 4. We need to all bandy together, because we are literally, they are ganging around us, everyone, all authorities, all politicians, all governments, and none of us are safe unless we all stick together. Secondly, we have to be stronger in challenging the lies, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we need to be, if you said, Reeta, no one likes to do stories about journalists. That's true, but actually journalism and what's happening to journalists is going to affect and is affecting everybody. So now's the time to sort of tear up that rule book and start looking at the big picture, which is that we're all going to be poorer for the fact that journalists are cowed and intimidated and in fear of being excluded from a news conference or in fear of being shot. So, and around the world, going back to your original question, they are full of vim at the thought that if someone in a big Western democracy can get away with treating people's journalists so badly, no one's going to give a toss about what's happening in Idlib or Sana'a or anywhere else, frankly.
Alex, thank you. A very grim assessment from all of you, really. Let's have some questions now. Zeba Malik and Kate Riley from the John Schofield Trust are going to come on and ask your questions, and then I will direct them to the best person. But if amongst our panelists you really want to answer that question, just put your hand up. All right.
Okay, so the first question is for Leah Passam, I suppose, just against the background of the kind of level of pessimism. There are still people who want to go into journalism, fortunately. So Leah's question is, what advice would you give to young and early career journalists watching this?
Ben, I'm going to give that one to you. Go on, make a case for journalism.
Don't be worried to be an obsessive. The one characteristic of the best journalists that I've worked with, and I've worked with quite a few, but I've been at Channel 4 News for a while, is the obsessive interest in a story. And that can sometimes come from a burning sense of social injustice or anger or emotion, but that obsession is to tell a story and to think it needs to be told is a really important thing. And I think quite early on in your career, when you are young and you are slightly obsessive, you're probably going to annoy a lot of people, especially the people who are going to be above you. But and you will be pushed back, and you will you'll get a negative reaction, but keep going. As long as you've got a story and it's not made up, because that obsession and that drive to tell a story is what you really need. And I think if you really want to be a journalist, you'll become a journalist. And I found that I spent a long time actually working with Alex Crawford as a runner and making tea and Kay Burley's breakfast.
It was never very good then.
No, I know. People still complain about it now. making Kay Burley's breakfast and other presenters, you know, all their foibles. And it was bloody annoying for a couple of years, and then I was an overnight desk assistant. But I always wanted to, and I know how many people I annoyed at Sky News, but I always wanted to do certain stories, and eventually I got to do them. And I think it's one of the things I do find, and I'm sure that the generation above me would have said this about me, was that there are a lot of journalists now, or people who have written a lot, or have a presence on social media, or have their own blog, and so you can self-publish. I think sometimes there can be, it's a very hard profession to get into, but I think sometimes people can be too put off too quickly, because they don't feel they're getting to the place they want to get to quick enough. If you're obsessive enough and you want it enough and you're good enough, you're going to get there. So carry on.
And I would completely second that. And I would also say that tenacity is very important. You know, if you don't succeed the first time, I know it's a cliche, but you really have to keep going. And journalism is one of those industries where, you know, you won't be penalized for being pushy. I don't mean particularly in an aggressive way, but to just keep going. You know, I kept failing to get onto a BBC training scheme until eventually I did, you know, and it was very disappointing. It didn't happen easily and it didn't happen quickly. So I absolutely, completely second what Ben says. Okay, should we have another question?
Just before, Reeta, can I come in on that one? And just
absolutely, please, yes.
Pick up on something that Jodie was saying as well earlier. I would advise anybody starting off, if you can, start local, start small. I think it really toughens you up to be close to your audience. Now, I know that's really difficult with the state of the local press at the moment, but there are really good projects out there like the Bureau Local who are doing some amazing investigative work. If you can get in local and the people who don't like what you do actually come and knock on the office door and tell you face to face they don't like what you do, you learn really bloody quickly. And you learn, you know, you do more stories, you get published more, it's really, really important, I think, to be close to the ground at the beginning of your career, because you can lose sight of you know, it's really important just to know what impacts on real people in their real lives. That's what you have to write about.
And all good local stories are essentially good national stories, aren't they? And I would say actually that now is the best time ever to be a journalist, because we need good journalists, and we need people who are hungry, who are young, who are energetic, who are full of future optimism, and who can be, you know, a change for good. We've never needed them more than now.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'll pick up on Sean's point. I think the thing that it teaches you doing local or similar is it gets rid of that fear, because I think when you're young, sometimes you're fearful of picking up the phone and speaking to strangers. If you work for a local paper, they kick you out the door and make you do vox pops and talk to people you've never met before, and you have to pick up the phone and all of that stuff. Well, often when you work for a bigger organization, you're basically rewriting press releases, frankly, and you're doing it at high speed, because in these days you're doing it for clicks and everything else. Yeah. And the further up the ladder you go, if you haven't learned to do an interview, listen, take notes, get over that fear, it becomes much harder. So actually, the more you can do that early and get it out of the way, the easier it becomes.
And one more point, just
yes, go ahead.
Pick up the bloody phone. Don't send an email. Don't send a tweet. Pick up the phone. Go and meet somebody. Conversation gets you far more than email.
Such good advice. Thank you. Kate and Zaber, another question.
Okay, this one's from somebody who says that I agree with Alex saying journalists should get tougher. Journalists should hold governments to account, but quite often they pay the price, unfortunately. And he mentions Khashoggi and Daphne in Malta and Jan Kuciak in Slovakia. What's your opinion of Dominic Raab and Jeremy Hunt claiming they support media and journalists because their work is vital? However, they stay silent and ignore the fact that Mr. Assange is in prison in London, indicted by the Trump administration for exposing war crimes and human rights abuses through WikiLeaks.
Who wants to take that one?
I could take it.
Jodie, go for it, please.
how long have you got? I
Not
think
that long.
So a couple of things. I think the silence on Assange is really troubling, and not just from Rob and others. I mean, there's a long history of foreign secretaries not getting involved in domestic affairs. So I think there's a plausible deniability that the Foreign Office doesn't comment on a domestic issue. However, firstly, the Foreign Office has not been good enough in speaking out publicly when we've seen media freedom violations overseas, despite its stated belief in the importance of media freedom. You know, our responses are often pretty lukewarm, frankly. And as Alex has already said, it's absolutely vital that governments like the UK are at the forefront of defending media freedom, because if they don't, the autocrats just look at that and say, well, they don't care about it in the UK. Why on earth should I care about it in this country? And it fuels their ability to crack down, is the first thing. I think secondly is, generally in the UK, we've been pretty poor about speaking out publicly about Assange. You know, whatever you may think about him as an individual, he was engaged in journalistic activity, and we should all be bloody terrified that it's potentially the US might be able to extradite someone for carrying out journalistic activity from the UK, and we ought to be much stronger in calling that out.
Yeah, I totally agree. What's happening to Julian Assange and what's happening in British courts is an absolute disgrace, and people should be very, very worried and actually ashamed of it. There was such an expert trashing job done on Julian Assange that they've managed to strip away virtually everything about. They've called him a spy, a narcissist, a rapist, I think. Blamed him for the deaths of various secret agents where none have been linked back to him. And all of those were just a trashing job to try and persuade journalists and members of the public to have no sympathy for him. So now there is very little sympathy about what's happening to him. And Jodie's right, he is a journalist. He literally published, reported on potential alleged war crimes by the American government and the American authorities. And that's why they think he needs to go to jail. That's what's at stake here. So not reporting it and the British government letting it happen, the whole court process, Jodie, I think you'll agree, has been an absolute farce, where actual independent observers haven't been allowed in a large part of the time. Under the guise of coronavirus or security or health implications. It's an absolute disgrace.
So this is interesting, because not everybody would view Julian Assange as a journalist. They don't think that he necessarily went through all the usual journalistic practices that we would do. Ben, Sean, do you have views on this?
So I worked with Julian Assange when he first came to the UK. We were the first, The Guardian published the, I think they were the Afghanistan papers, were they? Or the Afghanistan papers. And so I went to meet him. I didn't know who he was. He wasn't famous at the time, but he showed me all the documents he had. And I am not sure that I would describe him as a journalist, because he actually said to me that he wasn't. And what he was a gatherer of information, and a very person who believes strongly that all information should be freely available. And when he showed me, The Guardian had been working on this story for quite a long time, but when he showed us what he had, one of our first questions was, what are you going to redact? Because you're going to put into the public domain hundreds, if not thousands, of people's names who could be in danger. And he said, we're not going to redact anything. So we had to do what we did was we used the video material that he had exposed, and it was unbelievably important stuff. Extrajudicial killings, disregard for safety. I mean, the stuff he put out there was extraordinary. But we, as journalists, picked and made journalistic decisions as to what was interesting and in the public interest to be out there. He was very committed to all information. No information should be private. which is not what we do or can do, I think. So I think there is a difference. I am not across his trial as I should be, because we're a 1 hour news program and we've taken decisions.
When was the conversation you had with him, Ben? When was the conversation you had with him? Because I think an off the record briefing with you many years ago, and that must be about 9 or 10 years ago, because he was 7 years in the Ecuador embassy and another, nearly 2 years in Belmarsh. You can't be sticking to that story now. Secondly, the redaction that he said he wouldn't do, he actually did. It was someone else that let the password be known, and there were various things that weren't redacted. I don't know about the qualification about being a journalist or not. When does a person who's engaged in journalism become a journalist? What do we call a journalist? What formal training? Exactly. That's what we're getting up to. What formal training?
I'm just saying what he said himself. So, but I haven't been following.
I'm pretty sure he's got a different view now.
I think the key.
Sorry, can I just, because you just asked me a question, I'll answer it. I haven't been following the trial as close as I should do, because we haven't had the space during coronavirus and during the Trump election, and I'm sure it's a failure of ours, and I'll look at it again to see what the other what is going on with the court process. And I don't think we've had someone in there for about 4 days of the process, and we've been able to, and I'll have a longer chat with them.
Okay, Ben, can I just bring Jodie in briefly, and then I want to take one more question. Jodie.
So the key thing, I think, isn't whether, I think it's a red herring, this thing about is he a journalist or isn't he a journalist. The key thing is the way that the US government is using national security legislation to punish him. And if they can do it against Assange, they can do it against any journalist who speaks to, for example, someone in national defense, finds out something of national interest and publishes it. And that's what we should be worried about. I think we end up in this conversation about is he or isn't he a journalist? And it's actually what we should be focused on is, should we be terrified about the way in which the government is misusing and abusing its national security legislation to punish people publishing, seeking information that is potentially of the national interest.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's very much, we've been going down a cul-de-sac all the time. We're being led down cul-de-sacs about his personality, whether he's a journalist or a whistleblower, whether he had motives, whether he's a rapist or not. All of that is, in many ways, is not relevant to the argument of freedom of expression and freedom of information.
Okay, I want to take one more question, please. Sean, I might just try and move it on. Can I take one more question, Zeba and Kate?
There has actually been quite a lot of interest around Julian Assange, actually. Also, just to let you know, a lot of really good positive feedback from people. So thank you very much for this. So a question from Natasha Phillips. What do you think has contributed to government complacency and repressive freedom of expression policies directed at journalists? And what can journalists do to undo this?
Sean, can I bring you in there?
They know they can get away with it. This goes back to where we were at the beginning, that governments are inclined to pay less heed to what's in media unless they're planted in the media themselves. And I'm afraid a lot of journalists are complicit in just kowtowing to them and wheeling out these easy hits for them. I think it's really too easy prey. To go back slightly to where we were, it's not just in America where this attack on journalism using national security legislation happens. It happened last year, a couple of years ago, in Belfast. 2 journalists, undisputed journalists, producers of a film about police collusion in loyalist terrorism, were arrested at dawn, hauled through the courts, because they had obtained a leaked document in the UK. The PSNI and Durham Constabulary pursued them for 2 years until the courts threw it out. That same police force, the PSNI, is currently ignoring complaints from the Sunday World crime correspondent Patricia Devlin that she has been threatened with rape of herself, rape of her baby, and they know who the suspect is and they won't do anything about it. the suppression and oppression of journalism is happening here in the UK, and not just in the States or with Julian Assange. It's happening to accredited full-time UK journalists. And the government, Jeremy Hunt was going around a couple of years ago launching a campaign when he was Foreign Secretary for press freedom around the world, ignoring what was happening in this country. That one makes my blood boil.
I can tell. Anyone else want to come in quickly? No, okay. We are, amazingly, it is already 8 o'clock. I was wondering if I could just get each of you very briefly, because to say something positive about why young people should want to become journalists, because, you know, what you've given is a very bleak assessment, actually, of the pressures and constraints that people are under. Sean, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I am encouraged by something. As a bit of an old dinosaur who likes to meet people in public and areas and talk to them on the telephone, all this, what I am really encouraged by is some of the young reporters at the Times that I've worked with recently, who can do things with data and spreadsheets that I can't imagine. You know, there is some incredible journalism going on that bypasses the secrecy, that gets in under the skin of things, and gives us information that then allows us to go and knock on doors. And I am really impressed, really impressed with some of the young people coming into journalism.
Excellent. Jodie?
Well, I mean, I'm actually optimistic, and we started off by talking about the challenges, and they are big, but they're not insurmountable. And I think that's what I think is encouraging there. People are re-enthused about the importance of facts and getting at the truth. As Ben said, we're seeing a surge in people looking for trustworthy information. I think we're beginning to see a really healthy pushbacks against some of the more egregious elements of kind of the social media platforms. I'm not a huge fan of content regulation for them, but I do think there are other ways that we can use social media platforms and all of their great benefits for the good. And I think journalism is getting much better at that. So I think there's huge reasons to be positive, because we're in an environment where people realize how important access to trustworthy information is. Unfortunately, it's come out of a really terrible pandemic. I think it has woken people up to what it is that journalists do and why we're important. And I think that's actually gives me hope for the next few years.
Great, thank you. Alex?
Well, I think it's a great time to be a journalist. I mean, most journalists that I know are quite rebellious, and they're clearly argumentative. And there's never been a better time to really take on authority and to challenge things and to challenge the world. And don't be put off by the problems of coronavirus, because see that as an opportunity, because it's probably the biggest story that's going to dominate the world for the next 10 years in one way or another, either economically or health-wise or freedom of expression wise. And with the internet and the opportunities that offers as well as the things that we've also discussed, I think it's a really great time to take on everything and everyone and everybody. As someone who did start on local newspapers, I definitely think that's probably the reason why we're suffering part of the problems we are suffering, that there isn't a bedrock of support for local newspapers and local outlets, local TV stations, local radio stations. And we should, as a journalist body, we should really be thinking about trying to encourage that and to foster that. The paper that I started out on, which survived for decades and decades, closed a couple of years ago. And that is a tragedy when any local newspaper or local outlet closes, because I think the thing that young journalists or people aspiring to be journalists should think of is that, you know, you're running a marathon. So don't try and break the record in the first 100 meters. You've got to pace yourself, and you've got to learn, and you've got to soak up all the knowledge and the experience that others can offer you. And I'm speaking as probably someone who's spent the longest apprenticeship ever. I mean, I didn't get into foreign correspondency until I'd had 4 children and was in my mid-30s. So and I had so many rejections, starting right back in local newspapers. So I think, as the other guys have said, don't be put off. Now is the time to really seize the day.
Okay, great, thank you. And Ben?
Because it's fun.
Yeah.
And it's important, and you'll enjoy it. I enjoy every day of my job. Well, actually, most days. But it's really fun. You get to meet loads of people and then do them over. I'm joking. But people want to talk to you. Someone wants to say goodbye. People want to tell you their stories, and there's no greater feeling, and it does, I'm afraid, feed the ego of someone who is in a shit situation, and you tell a story which helps expose that situation, and you help them. It's an incredible motivation to do so, and in the process, you will have a lot of fun. If you're fortunate, like Alex and myself and others, you will get to see the world, and you will have stories to bore people with pub for the rest of your life. But most of all, if you really are suited to it, you will enjoy it, and that is a big part of life, I think.
Hear, hear. Thank you all very much indeed. That was really a riveting conversation. Thank you very much to the audience too for joining us. Just remind you, if you want more information about the John Schofield Trust, please have a look at the website. And I'm delighted to be able to tell you that the Trust, which is a registered charity, has hit its target of raising £25,000 for its Newsrooms for All campaign. So thank you to everyone who's already donated. And the page is still open tonight. So if you still want to donate, please do, so that the Trust can continue to provide more events just like this one. I also wanted to say that there are 6 more days to apply for the John Schofield Trust's 2021 Apprentice and Early Career Mentoring Scheme for journalists. So if you want to grab this chance of mentoring by an experienced journalist for a whole year, please don't miss the deadline, which is Wednesday, the 21st of October. And if you have any questions about that, there is some guidance that's being tweeted out now. So thank you all very much indeed, once again, and good evening.